I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. On this program, we feature leading newsmakers and the New York Times journalists who cover them. This week, New York Times economics reporter Stefanos Chen stops by to unpack a recent report showing a dramatic rise in poverty in New York City, reversing several years of progress. But first, the battle for control of the U.S. House of Representatives. It may come down to whether New York State Democratic legislators can tweak congressional district lines in their favor, and by how much. New York politics and government reporter Nicholas Fandos has been covering the story. He joins us now. Nick, it seems like the Democrats in the legislature didn't go as far as they could have. Was that because they weren't being greedy or they were being prudent?
Well, I don't know that we should ever assign them better motives than we need to. They certainly were being prudent. We've got to step back and remember that 2 years ago they got really greedy and tried to pass a pretty aggressive gerrymander across the state that would have stacked the deck for Democrats in something like 22 of 26 districts. And they got totally slapped down in court and ended up with a court-drawn special master map that helped Republicans pick up a bunch of seats. This time around, I think they were they wanted another shot at drawing. They went to court to get it, but they were very wary of making the same mistake. And so what we saw yesterday was the adoption of a new map that makes some targeted tweaks that will help Democrats in key swing districts, but didn't kind of rewrite the whole map in the way that I think some Republicans had feared and some partisan Democrats, frankly, were cheering on.
Nick, how different was this map that was approved by the legislature, including some Republicans, from the bipartisan districting map that was proposed originally?
Yeah, so there's three sets of maps to think about. The ones currently on the books, there was an interim step where a bipartisan commission recommended lines that the legislature then rejected and adopted their own. It turns out they didn't change them that significantly from the commission, which hadn't changed the current map all that much. We're really talking about 4 or 5 districts that have changed. On Long Island, Tom Suozzi's going to get a much easier race after he just won that tough special election. In the Hudson Valley, it was kind of where the commission shored up 2 incumbents, a Republican and a Democrat. The Democrats in the legislature went in and took away the Republicans' advantage. Mm-hmm. But the seat kind of looks like it does now. That's Mark Molinaro's seat in the Catskills in the Hudson Valley. And then in Syracuse, they adopted basically the same maps the commission had, which really put the incumbent Republican there, Brandon Williams, at a huge disadvantage. He's very likely to lose that race unless he can outrun, the top of the ticket by double digits.
So what is that going to mean for control of the House, considering everything else pretty much stays the same?
I think the top line is, like, New York remains a huge battleground. Basically, New York and California have more swing seats in play than any other states in the country. And frankly, there's enough seats here, probably a half dozen, that are going to be really competitive that could tip the House one way or another. Remember, Republicans have a 3-seat majority now. It's more like a 4-seat majority once certain vacancies are filled. But that's not very much. That could easily, Democrats could easily flip that many seats here in New York, or they could lose them and Republicans could hold on by a thread. So I think, we're still looking for a real fight across the country, but a fight here in New York where we thought maybe the Democrats would make it harder for the Republicans to hold on here.
Now, the last time around, did the Democrats blow it because of the district lines or because they ran lousy campaigns?
Well, it's a great question. It's maybe a little bit of both. They were very eager to point to the lines. But if you actually go and do the analysis, they would have lost pretty much every district, save for maybe one that they lost anyway, even on those other configurations. They just, 2022 was a terrible year for Democrats in New York. Lee Zeldin ran a really strong gubernatorial campaign. Voters seemed quite frustrated with ruling Democrats. So I don't know that it was as decisive in 22 as it seemed to be. And as a corollary, I'm not sure the changes are going to be the thing that are going to determine who wins in the fall. Enough of these districts are close enough that the better candidate who better speaks to the issue is probably going to win.
In local races. And what is the impact of the presidential race on local congressional races in New York State?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, typically what we see is that in a presidential year, you see much higher turnout across the country, and that trend is really true here in New York. The lower propensity voters who come out historically in New York have been Democrats. So Democrats presume that in a district like Mike Lawler in the suburbs north of New York City, in a presidential style electorate, like they will fare much better than they did in the midterms. Now, obviously, we don't know what this could all depend on. Is it really a Trump-Biden race? How does the country feel about those two candidates? Maybe turnout is not what it was 4 years ago. Maybe Biden's numbers, there's some reason to think Biden's margin of victory might decrease a little bit in New York, which could help those Republicans. We don't know, but there will definitely be an impact from the top of the ticket.
And as you pointed out, the Republicans were, if not chortling, at least a little bit self-satisfied about the way this turned out. The Democrats, at least many of them, disappointed. Does it look like there will be any Republican challenge to these lines, saying they still favor the Democrats too much?
Ronald Lauder, the billionaire cosmetics heir who is very involved in New York politics, helped sue last time, put a warning out very early and said, I am ready to go right back to court. And whether the Democrats listened to that or they didn't need it, they drew these maps, and now Lauder and company say there's no need for a lawsuit. So I don't think we're headed for court. This may finally be the end of what has been a pretty haywire 2 years of chaos in New York congressional land.
And what role did Hakeem Jeffries play in this, the congressman who is the minority leader of the House from Brooklyn? Did he really oversee this whole strategy as to how far the Democrats would go in redistricting?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I mean, Jeffries not only wants a Democratic majority, but he would become Speaker, presumably, if he gets it. So there's a certain amount of skin in the game for him and home state pride as a New Yorker. And he appointed a couple of lieutenants who were members of Congress but involved in New York state politics to kind of be intermediaries in this process. And I think it's fair to say the commission map was voted down in large part because he gave it a thumbs down, and this map got his thumbs up and became law. And I think generally what we can say is that it reflects, I think, some of his political values, which are to try to strategically press Democrats' advantage in key places, but play it a little conservative. Don't go so far that you end up in court in a totally chaotic situation. He was a lawyer for many years, and this is in some ways, I think, is a lawyer's map.
And don't wind up getting it thrown back at your face again and lose everything.
Right, and have a primary delayed, and yeah, it would just be a mess. And I don't think they want a mess. I think the Democrats they've got the ball on the tee. Now it's time to play. What
do we take away from Tom Suozzi's victory in Nassau County as a Democrat?
Well, I think that it certainly gave the Democrats some good vibes that they had needed, which will help with activists and donors as they're trying to set up these races. Now, predicting what's the correlation between special elections and a general election this fall is probably not as strong as the winning party would like you to think it is. But it's not bad news. It's certainly good news, and I think, if nothing else, Suozzi gave a lot of Democrats who are going to be running in hard districts across the country kind of a playbook to figure out how to handle immigration and the migrant crisis, which is a big issue nationally, but especially here in New York, a playbook to talk about inflation and crime, and to talk to voters who, frankly, may be turned off by the Democratic brand right now. President Biden's approval rating in that district is, totally in the gutter, and Suozzi won it pretty handily by really not being afraid to talk about all these issues that are maybe coded as Republican issues. He dove into them. He talked, in a pretty aggressive way about the need to bring order to the border. And it seems like voters responded to that.
And what role did the Middle East play in that election?
Yeah, we're still waiting for some of the exact results, but that district, which is part of Queens and Long Island, is one of the most Jewish congressional districts in the country. And so the war that's unfolding right now was a major campaign issue in a way you wouldn't normally expect in just a given House race. Republicans put up a candidate who was an Israeli military veteran, actually, an Orthodox Jewish woman who really, I think, was compelled to run in the first place because of the events of October 7th. Suozzi's a longtime supporter of Israel. And so the race was really a test, I thought, of whether or not American Jews who, particularly in the suburbs, have tended to be a part of the Democratic base would reconsider that. Not because of Tom Suozzi, but because they're concerned about what they're hearing from his party, particularly on the left. And we'll have to see the exact data, but it looks like there was not a huge breakaway there. Suozzi was able to hold a lot of those voters, which I think is probably a reassuring sign for Democrats.
Kirsten Gillibrand running for re-election this year for the U.S. Senate. Any likelihood of a challenge in the Democratic primary, and what about her Republican opponent?
There was a lot of buzz about the possibility of a primary. I guess it was about a year ago now. After Gillibrand had run for president, she was seen as not particularly visible in New York, and some people were wondering, does she even want to run again? Well, she put that question to rest. She is running again, and no primary challenger has emerged. I think at this point we're probably unlikely to see one. The Republicans last week tried to give the nod to this guy, Mike Sapercone, who's a former NYPD detective. He's made a bunch of money in the private security business. He's kind of a centrist, but he's got a competitive primary against a couple more conservative opponents. And just yesterday, just this week, we saw, some real Republican infighting spill into the open. Former Congressman Pete King, who's quite well known on Long Island, who had just endorsed Sapercone, came out and said, wait a second, I just found out this guy had donated money to Letitia James, the Attorney General. We can't back him. Nobody can support him. He called on him to quit the race. Sapercone's not quitting, but there's kind of a full, little Republican civil war, which I got to think does not help their chances of beating Kirsten Gillibrand, which were probably not very good in the first place. New York's still a Democratic state. 2022 was a very good year for Republicans, and they still couldn't win statewide. So I would guess she's safe.
An update on one other upcoming race, even though it's not upcoming too soon, the mayoral race. How does Mayor Adams stand? He is an incumbent, very hard to beat an incumbent. At least one candidate has announced already the possibility of challenging him in a Democratic primary. How strong is he?
Yeah, it's a great question that we're going to find out a lot more on in the next 6 months. I mean, he is not strong in the polls. He has the specter of a federal investigation into his campaign hanging over him right now. That's been hanging out there for several months. We don't know, are there going to be charges? Are there not going to be charges? He has not been accused of wrongdoing at this point. But I think both those things have certainly helped fuel the possibility of primary challenges. Scott Stringer, as you mentioned, a former mayoral candidate and city comptroller, has gotten into the race. I think other candidates will follow. Adams has gotten some good news in terms of the budget in the last several weeks. He's been able to kind of pare back some proposed cuts that would have been quite unpopular with New Yorkers. So that helps him. But he, as far as an incumbent mayor headed into re-election, I would say he seems weaker than we've seen in quite a while.
And taking a harder line on migrants this past week as well.
Right.
Nicholas Fandos of the New York Times, thank you so much for joining us. And coming up next, poverty on the rise again in New York. For the last several years, the official poverty rate had been declining in New York City, but according to a recent report by Columbia University and the nonprofit Robin Hood Foundation, the number of people experiencing poverty in New York has jumped by 500,000, including 1 in 4 children. Here to discuss the details is New York economy reporter Stefanos Chen of the New York Times. Stefanos, how do we define poverty in New York? What does it mean to be poor in New York City?
Well, it has a pretty objective definition by this report and by the way the census defines this, which is that folks have difficulty affording the bare essentials, housing, food, medical care. And so this report sets out a line in which we see that they define poverty for a family of 4, meaning 2 adults and 2 kids, as around $44,000 in New York City.
And is that a realistic measure? I mean, if someone actually had that much money and they went week to week, month to month, and they had to pay for those essentials, could they support themselves with that kind of income?
Well, the idea is that if you are below the poverty line, that you struggle in many different ways, whether that's paying for the rent at the end of the month, the cost of groceries are jumping everywhere in the city. So it's basically a measure of how well you can hack it in the city. The report also shows that folks above that poverty line also struggle, which shows that this line, even though there's a definition for it, there are folks more broadly who are still struggling in the city.
And there were historical poverty lines that were, kind of made up, not exactly made up, but somewhat arbitrary originally. And then there were, as you explained in your stories in the Times, more up-to-date ones that took into account food stamps and other things, and also took into account higher costs for health care, for transportation. So where does this measure fall into that category?
This report uses something called the supplemental poverty measure, which the census also does as an alternative to their official measure. So it's a widely understood and used metric, and it's useful in this moment in particular because the biggest reason why more people fell into poverty is because pandemic-era programs from the government, expanded benefits for unemployment, health care, other benefits like that have most expired. And this supplemental measure actually captures that in a way that the official poverty measure does not.
Mm-hmm. So why is it when we hear the mayor, other people saying we have hit record employment, we've bounced back from the pandemic, do we have so many people living in poverty?
Well, we've reported a bit about that as well, which I think the city is touting the very high employment numbers that they've reached. They've recovered other jobs from the pandemic by their numbers, which on a top-line level is a great success and ahead of schedule. But if you look below the surface, what you find is there are very deep fissures in how folks are faring, whether that's along racial lines. In New York City, the black unemployment rate is about 3 times the white unemployment rate. The jobs that we have lost, for instance, were better paying jobs primarily in industries like retail and hospitality. And the jobs that are replacing them are in much lower paying jobs like in home health care, like live-in nurses who get paid about $32,000 a year, which is just scraping by.
And why is it that children are suffering so much? We, have done a lot for senior citizens in terms of, Medicare, Medicaid, other benefits like that. But why, 1 in 4 children living in poverty in this city, this wealthy city, or a city that prides itself on being so wealthy, that's an enormous number.
It is, and I think it speaks also to the end of the benefits we were discussing. There was a child tax credit that was beefed up during the pandemic, which essentially was more money in the pockets of people who were straddling that poverty line to begin with. When that money was pulled back from the federal government and the state government, what we see is that many of these families fell back into poverty and are no longer able to afford the things that they could in the middle of the pandemic.
And how does New York City compare to the rest of the country, to big cities in the rest of the country, in terms of the gap and also in terms of the acceleration of the pace of people falling into poverty?
Well, the data looks at the difference between 21 and 22. And when you look nationally at the same data, we see that the trend is very similar. More children fell into poverty nationwide. The jump in poverty soared from 21 to 22 for many of the same reasons, the end of many of those pandemic-era programs. New York is, though, still an outlier in some ways, just because of how vast the differences are from the richest and poorest. And we've reported a bit about what that gap looks like. And it's a very jarring gap from top to bottom. And actually, the wealth inequality in New York City is currently at the widest it's ever been.
And how do we account for the racial, ethnic differences in poverty level? Is that based on education? Is it based on something else? Is it based on discrimination? How do we account for those big disparities?
Yeah, well, there's many reasons, and I think it's hard to untangle them all. But disproportionately, many of the jobs lost were in industries where you had Black, Latino, and Asians employed. Those jobs leave, and we know from past research that it is harder for Blacks and Latinos in particular to regain employment in the city. So it speaks also to longstanding discrimination in the city and in employment patterns, but also the fact that they were hit harder. They were in a lot of the face-to-face essential work that happened during the pandemic, and many of them haven't recovered yet.
a family of four making $44,000 less than that, they would be in poverty, according to official statistics in New York City. Can people in the rest of the country understand that? Can they understand that $44,000, which may sound like a lot to them, is not all that much in New York?
Yeah, I think, ask that person to move into New York for a couple of weeks and they'll pick it up pretty quick.
Right.
Yeah, 44,000 may sound decent elsewhere, but actually the median income in New York City is 75,000. And that's just, again, to be sort of in the middle. And we've had record increases in rent, and we're a city of renters more so than homeowners. So that has affected many people. And if you just look at the cost of groceries, that they've soared as well in the city.
And how about the inflation rate in New York City compared to nationally? Is that really eating away at people's incomes too?
I think that's more of a national issue, but yes, in New York City, you see that they may have come down from their peaks in 21 and 2, but that they're still stubbornly high. And we're seeing that both from commercial vendors who talk to us about the cost of their businesses to end-use consumers as well.
And what about millionaires in the city? Mayor Bloomberg had always said that he never minded attracting more millionaires to the city because they obviously pay for the taxes for everybody else. Are we seeing an outflow of millionaires, an influx of millionaires, and how is that affecting tax revenue?
We reported on that phenomenon recently, and it's interesting that the narrative early on in the pandemic was that we're losing a lot of millionaires, and you got to do something to keep them because they are the tax base, which is true, but in this more recent report, there's evidence that millionaires are growing as a class in New York City, and we're actually minting more millionaires because the stock markets have done fairly well. It's the middle class and the lower income folks who are now heading for the exits. And that is something that I think policymakers are looking at as perhaps a reason why policy should be geared at those folks and making sure that they don't leave the city because they're the ones working these jobs that we're referring to here.
Well, I don't want to sound cynical, but is it better or worse if poor people leave the city?
Well, I think even in the Hamptons, you find that you need someone to do these blue collar jobs. And there is, I think the economy relies very much on blue collar labor. And if you don't find affordable housing for those folks and you push them further and further out of the city, it just doesn't work.
You're not going to get millionaires to do that.
There you go.
They're not going to mow your lawn.
Right. The things that I think that attract millionaires to the city is the hard work of the folks who kept the city alive during the pandemic.
Exactly. Bring us up to date on casinos, something you've been covering all along. And we're now sort of approaching the point where there are going to be some decisions on where those casinos in New York City are going to be.
Yeah, speaking of a tax plan in a way to generate more tax revenue, there's close to a dozen of these casino plans that have been made public. The state gaming board is about to respond to the developers with their final round of questions. And we expect that could be done in the next couple of weeks or months. And once that is out, the developers who are bidding on these casinos have about a month to get back to them and officially make their bids. But we're just now entering this next stage of the mudslinging, the lobbying, the fighting between these developers because you can only get up to 3 of these casinos in downstate New York.
And on what basis do they make the decision? Do they make the decision on politics, on lobbying, on economic development, on how much revenue is provided to the city, on which neighborhoods are going to benefit most, or all of the above?
Well, there is a very detailed rubric as to what the bid has to achieve to be considered, and local input matters a lot with each of these bids. They have to show that they're going to generate jobs. They have to show what the economic impact will be. And many of these are also attaching housing components to their projects, basically as many sweeteners as they can to make the bitter poison, the bitter pill go down in a sense, because casinos in general are not popular across the city. We've seen electeds who are very skeptical of their benefits. So what all these developers are doing instead is trying to marry it with these social goods so that it becomes more palatable.
And casinos have been a disappointment in many respects all around the country for decades. Do we have any real sense as to how much revenue they will produce for New York City?
It's hard to say. I think many of these bids will start coming in soon that show or will claim to show the economic benefit. The bids themselves will have to set a minimum tax rate in which the gaming is going to be taxed. So there will be estimates as to how much money can be generated. We do know, though, from tax policy research that the creation of casinos may create a lot of revenue early on at the onset of the casino, but that some years later it peters off. And so there will be questions among all these local community groups that are deciding whether they want them, if in the long term this is something that's going to benefit their communities.
Okay, we'll be watching for your updates in the Times. Stefanos Chen of the New York Times, thank you so much for joining us. And coming up next, I'll have some personal thoughts on why history matters. In Alan Bennett's play, The History Boys, one of the students is asked to define history. He pauses to think for a minute and finally propounds, history is just one damn thing after another. One reason New Yorkers and the nation are twisted in knots in debates over race and anti-Semitism is, as the song says, we don't know much about history. If we ever learned it, we've forgotten it. If we were never taught it, we lack the context it provides, the perspective that history isn't static, it's organic. It cries out for reinterpretation. What distinguished New Amsterdam from all the other American colonies was that it tolerated immigrants from all over. It wasn't necessarily about humanitarianism. New Amsterdam was a company town. Anyone who helped it prosper was welcome. While New York did become a beacon for immigrants, let's remember that New Yorkers greeted each new wave with misgivings, even though everyone who was already here had come from someplace else. The Statue of Liberty wasn't gifted to New York as a welcome mat for foreigners. It was originally a symbol of liberty emanating from America. 4 decades later, Congress curtailed immigration altogether. We're only starting to face up to the dark side of our heritage. But can we frankly explore the roots of anti-Semitism without reading James Carroll's magisterial study, Constantine's Sword? Can we pretend to understand racism without thinking how a black parent explains to his child why a flesh-colored crayon or Band-Aid is beige and not dark brown? Can we confront fears of majority-minority America within 2 decades without acknowledging that in the 19th century, many Native Americans didn't consider the Irish, Italians, Jews, and Greeks as white, which most Hispanic people consider themselves today, while Middle Easterners seek their own identity from the census? Or will we smugly retreat to our silos and let history repeat itself, just one damn thing after another? For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.